In the beginning, there was nothing but chaos. No sky, no earth, no seas, just an endless void, dark and formless. It wasn't chaos like confusion or mess, but rather a deep, unstructured nothingness. This was a time before time itself, before the sun, the moon, and the stars. Chaos was the first thing to exist, the foundation of all things that would come later. But even in this emptiness, there were sparks of potential, and from chaos, other beings began to emerge. The first of these was Gaia, the earth. Gaia was not like the earth we know now. She was a powerful and ancient force, embodying all the fertile soil, the towering mountains and the vast plains. She was the very essence of the land, the ground beneath our feet, the foundation of life. Alongside her came Tartarus, a dark and gloomy place, deep beneath the earth. It wasn't just a pit, but a vast, terrifying chasm, where the deepest fears and darkest aspects of existence were held. Tartarus would later become the prison for the worst of the gods, but at this point, it was just part of the initial makeup of the world. It represented the darker, deeper, more mysterious parts of the universe, those places where even light struggled to reach. From this initial pairing of chaos with Gaia and Tartarus came Nyx, the personification of the night. Nyx was as old as time itself, and in her darkness was not something to fear but something powerful and necessary. She wrapped the world in her shadow, her presence a constant reminder of the balance that existed between light and dark. Nyx was not evil, but rather a force of nature, as essential to the world as the sun was, and with her came Erebus, the embodiment of darkness. He was the deepest part of the night, a place where all light was consumed. Together, Nyx and Erebus represented the quiet, hidden side of the world, the places that often go unseen but are no less important than the visible realms. But from this darkness also came Eros, the god of love and desire. Eros was not just romantic love, but the spark that made everything in the universe come together. In the beginning, he was not a beautiful young boy with wings as he would later be depicted in myth. Instead, Eros was a primal force, more a current that ran through everything, from the tiniest grain of sand to the stars in the sky. Love, in his purest form, was not soft or gentle, but an energetic and powerful force that pushed everything into existence. It was through Eros that the universe found balance, through the power of attraction and connection that tied everything together. These were the first beings, the primordial gods who set the stage for all that would follow. From them the world began to take shape. As these beings moved through the dark void of the universe, things began to shift. The stars began to form, and the oceans began to stir. But the most significant change came when Gaia, the earth, gave birth to Uranus, the sky. Uranus was not just a sky like we think of today, but the very heavens themselves. He was the great dome above the earth, stretching out as far as the eye could see, filled with stars and clouds and the endless cosmos. Gaia and Uranus became inseparable, their relationship one of balance and unity. Together they created more children, and these children were to become the first true gods in Greek mythology. The first of their children were the Titans, a group of giant, powerful beings who were each connected to different aspects of the world. There was Oceanus, who ruled over the vast oceans that surrounded the earth. There was Hyperion, the Titan of the sun, and his sister Thea, the goddess of sight. There was Mnemosyne, the Titaness of memory, and Themis, who represented divine law and order. Each Titan had a role to play in the growing world, and together they helped shape everything around them. But not all was peaceful. Uranus, though powerful, was afraid of the power of his children. He saw in them a force that might one day overtake him, and so he decided to imprison them. Deep within the earth, Uranus trapped his own children, keeping them from ever seeing the light of day. Gaia, heartbroken by the sight of her children's suffering, became enraged. She could not stand to see her beloved children locked away, unable to fulfill their potential. So she turned to her youngest Titan, Cronus, asking him to bring an end to Uranus's rule. Cronus was not the eldest or the strongest, but he was clever and determined. With Gaia's help, Cronus crafted a great sickle, a weapon capable of cutting through anything, even the heavens themselves. One night, when Uranus came to lie with Gaia, Cronus struck, castrating his father, and taking his place as the new ruler of the world. The blood that spilled from Uranus's wound gave birth to new beings, Erinyes, the Furies, who would hunt down wrongdoers, and the giants, great and terrible creatures of the earth. But even after Uranus's fall, the world was not yet at peace. Cronus became the new king, but his rule was built on fear, and it would not last. He was warned by a prophecy that one of his own children would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his father. So in an effort to prevent this, Cronus did the same thing his father had done. He swallowed each of his children as they were born, keeping them trapped inside him. Cronus's wife, Rhea, was devastated, but she knew she could not allow the cycle of cruelty to continue. When their youngest son Zeus was born, Rhea took action. She hid the baby in a cave on the island of Crete, giving Cronus a rock wrapped in swaddling clothes instead. Zeus grew up in secret, protected by nymphs and raised by the kind-hearted nymphs of Crete. As he grew, so did his power. When he became old enough, Zeus returned to confront his father. He gave Cronus a potion that made him vomit up his siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades and Poseidon, who had been trapped inside him. Together they waged war against Cronus and the Titans, a battle that would come to be known as the Titanomachy. And that is how the world was set in motion, how the first gods were born, and how they began to shape the universe as we know it. It all started with that first silent void, chaos, and from it came everything, from the first gods to the lands, the seas and the sky. The gods' stories are far from simple, and they continue to echo through history, shaping the way we think about power, love, and the very fabric of existence. After the dramatic overthrow of Uranus, Cronus rose to power as the new ruler of the world. He was a powerful Titan, strong and clever, but his reign was not without its burdens. Having freed the world from the rule of his father, Cronus set about bringing order and stability to the universe. But there was something troubling him from the very start, a prophecy that foretold that one of his own children would eventually overthrow him, just as he had overthrown Uranus. Cronus could not ignore this prophecy. In his mind, the only way to prevent it from coming true was to ensure that none of his children could ever grow strong enough to challenge him. So, as soon as his children were born, Cronus made a drastic decision. He swallowed each of them whole, taking away their chance to grow and take their place in the world. Rhea, his wife, was devastated. She had hoped that her children would bring joy and life to their world, but instead they were consumed by her husband in a cruel twist of fate. Each time Rhea gave birth, Cronus swallowed the child without hesitation. First came Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, followed by Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. Then came Hera, the goddess of marriage, followed by Hades, the god of the underworld, and Poseidon, the god of the seas. Each child was taken from Rhea almost as soon as they were born, swallowed by the very man who should have protected them. The loss was unbearable for Rhea, but there was nothing she could do. She tried to bear her sorrow in silence, but the grief weighed heavily on her heart. As the years passed, Rhea began to lose hope. But when she was pregnant with her sixth child, she couldn't bear the thought of losing another baby to Cronus. This child, she believed, was the one who could change everything. She knew that if she didn't act now, the prophecy would never be prevented, and the cycle of destruction would continue. So when the time came for her to give birth, Rhea made a bold decision. She secretly traveled to the island of Crete, far from the watchful eyes of Cronus. There, in a cave hidden deep in the mountains, she gave birth to a son, whom she named Zeus. To protect him, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and gave it to Cronus, pretending it was the newborn baby. Cronus, unsuspecting, swallowed the stone and once again believed that he had prevented the prophecy from coming true. Meanwhile, Zeus was raised in secret by the nymphs and other creatures of Crete, hidden away from the world. His early years were filled with love and care, as the nymphs cared for him as if he were their own. Zeus grew strong and clever, his powers developing rapidly as he matured. He knew, even from a young age, that his destiny was to one day challenge Cronus and free his siblings from the prison of his father's stomach. But Zeus also knew that this would not be an easy task. He would need allies, strength, and most of all cunning to defeat the mighty Cronus and the other Titans. As Zeus grew, he learned more about the world around him. He learned about the ancient beings who had ruled before him, the Titans who had been born from Gaia and Uranus. He learned about his siblings, trapped in Cronus's belly, and he understood the weight of the prophecy that had cast such a shadow over his family. He also learned about the world that awaited him beyond Crete, the world that was ruled by the mighty Titans, a world that needed to be changed. One day, when Zeus was old enough, he decided it was time to take action. He left his secret home in Crete and traveled to the court of his father, Cronus. When Zeus arrived, he was just a young god, full of ambition and courage. But Cronus, who had grown arrogant and confident in his reign, did not recognize the danger that lay before him. Zeus approached his father and, with the help of a powerful potion, tricked Cronus into vomiting up his siblings. First came Hesea, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, and finally Poseidon. Each of them had been trapped in Cronus's stomach for years, but now they were free. Together, Zeus and his siblings launched an all-out rebellion against Cronus and the other Titans. The war that followed would be known as the Titanomachy, a battle that would change the course of history forever. The Titans were powerful, but they were not invincible. Zeus, now with the strength of his siblings at his side, led the charge against his father and the other Titans. The battle raged on for 10 years, with the Olympians, as they now called themselves, clashing against the Titans in fierce combat. But even with the strength of his siblings, Zeus knew that they would not be able to defeat the Titans without help. So Zeus sought out allies in the form of the Cycles and the 100-handed ones, two groups of ancient beings who had been imprisoned by Uranus and later freed by Zeus. The Cycles were skilled craftsmen, able to forge weapons of immense power, while the 100-handed ones were fierce and formidable warriors. Together they became crucial to the Olympians' victory. The battle between the Olympians and the Titans was fierce and unrelenting. The skies darkened with the roar of thunder, and the earth itself trembled with the force of the combat. Cronus and the Titans fought with all their might, but they were no match for the united power of the Olympians. In the end, the Titans were defeated, and Zeus stood victorious. Cronus, along with many of the other Titans, was cast into Tartarus, the dark abyss beneath the earth, where they would remain imprisoned for eternity. With the Titans defeated, Zeus and his siblings took their places as the new rulers of the world. Zeus became the ruler of the sky, Poseidon took control of the seas, and Hades became the lord of the underworld. The world was divided, and each god ruled over their domain. The Olympian era had begun, and the gods began to shape the world in their image, creating humans, animals, and all the wonders of the earth. But even though Zeus had won, his reign was not without its challenges. He knew that the Titans would not be easily forgotten, and that there were other forces in the world that would continue to challenge his rule. But for now he stood as the king of the gods, and the world was his to shape. The age of the Titans was over, and the age of the Olympians had begun. With the defeat of the Titans, and the establishment of the Olympian gods as the new rulers of the cosmos, a new era began. Zeus, now standing tall as the supreme leader, divided the world among himself and his siblings. The world had been shaped by the battle between the Olympians and the Titans, but now it was time to govern it. It was a fresh start, and yet the world still carried the echoes of the ancient struggles that had come before. The first task was to divide the realms, the very domains that the gods would rule over for all eternity. Zeus, as the leader, took the sky as his domain, the heavens above where the clouds roamed free and the sun shone down on all that lived below. His realm was one of power and control, where he would sit on his mighty throne watching over the earth with a vigilant eye. As king of the gods, Zeus became the ruler of the thunder and the lightning, and it was through his command that storms would rage and the skies would crack open with bolts of fury. Poseidon, Zeus's brother, was granted dominion over the seas. The oceans were vast and wild, and Poseidon, with his trident in hand, became the master of the deep waters. He could cause earthquakes, summon raging tides, and stir up the waves with a mere flick of his trident. The seas became Poseidon's kingdom, where he ruled over the fish, the ships, and the creatures of the deep. His domain was both beautiful and terrifying, a place where the power of the gods could be felt with every crash of the waves. But Poseidon's rule was not just about water. He also controlled horses, and with his creation of these magnificent creatures, he brought beauty and terror in equal measure to the earth. Hades, the third brother, was given control over the underworld, the realm of the dead. Unlike the bright skies of Zeus and the boundless seas of Poseidon, Hades ruled over a dark and gloomy realm, a place where the souls of the dead journeyed after their time on earth had come to an end. The underworld was a place of shadows and silence, where rivers like the Styx and Acheron flowed, separating the living from the dead. Hades, though not often seen by the living, held a power that was just as immense as his brothers. His realm was filled with the spirits of the deceased, and he ruled with a stern and silent presence. He also had control over the spirits of the dead and the fates of those who had passed, and it was through his rule that the cycle of life and death continued without fail. The world was now divided into three major realms, each with its ruler. Zeus held the heavens, Poseidon ruled the seas, and Hades presided over the underworld. But the earth, the fertile ground upon which all life existed, remained unclaimed. This was Gaia's realm, and it was her legacy that lived on in the land itself. The earth was not ruled by any single god but was the shared domain of all gods, where the gods could come and go as they pleased. The earth was the land of mortals, a place where the gods would interact with humans, either in the form of blessings or punishments, depending on their moods. But there was more to the division of power than just the major realms. Each of the gods had their own duties and responsibilities, and with these came their own followers, their own sacred places, and their own stories to tell. The Olympians, though united in their rule, each had their own unique role to play in the grand scheme of things. Hera, the wife of Zeus, became the queen of the gods and the goddess of marriage and family. Her domain was one of love and devotion, but also of jealousy and vengeance. Hera was deeply protective of her marriage and would stop at nothing to ensure that her sanctity was preserved. She was both revered and feared by mortals and gods alike, for her wrath was legendary, especially when it came to matters of infidelity and betrayal. Though she was Zeus's wife, their relationship was often tumultuous, and many of her stories were ones of betrayal, jealousy, and revenge. Despite these darker aspects, Hera was also a nurturing mother figure, especially in relation to her children, such as Ares, the god of war. Demeter, the goddess of the harvest and the earth's fertility, was another of the powerful Olympians. She had dominion over the crops, the seasons, and the earth's natural cycles. Her power brought abundance to the land, and the mortals relied heavily on her for the success of their crops and the health of the soil. Demeter's love for her daughter Persephone was one of the most well-known myths in Greek mythology. Persephone was kidnapped by Hades, and Demeter, in her grief, caused the world to fall into a state of barrenness and famine. It wasn't until Persephone's return that the earth regained its fertility, and the cycle of seasons was restored. Demeter's domain was a blend of nurturing and grief, creation and destruction, and her power could bring both bounty and desolation. Ares, the son of Zeus and Hera, became the god of war. His domain was one of conflict, violence, and the chaos of battle. Ares was not known for his wisdom or strategy, rather he embodied the brutal and chaotic aspects of war. While the other gods viewed war in a more measured and deliberate light, Ares reveled in the bloodshed and destruction it caused. He was often depicted as a fierce, uncaring god, loved by few but feared by many. Ares' domain was one that existed in opposition to the more peaceful aspects of life, but it was no less necessary. Athena, the daughter of Zeus, was the goddess of wisdom, courage, and strategic warfare. She was born fully grown from Zeus's head after he swallowed her mother, Metis, the goddess of wisdom. Athena's wisdom and foresight made her one of the most important gods in Greek mythology, and she was highly revered by mortals and immortals alike. Her domain was one of intellect and reason, and her strategic approach to warfare made her a key figure in many of the great battles of Greek myth. Unlike Ares, Athena represented the more calculated and thoughtful side of war, using her mind and wisdom to guide warriors to victory. Apollo, the god of music, prophecy, and the sun, was one of the most beloved Olympians. Apollo was the embodiment of harmony, light, and beauty. His music could soothe the hearts of gods and mortals alike, and his prophetic abilities allowed him to see into the future. He was the god who brought light to the world and was associated with healing, poetry, and the arts. Apollo's connection to the sun made him a powerful figure in Greek mythology, and he was revered as a bringer of life and light. Artemis, Apollo's twin sister, was the goddess of the moon, hunting, and the wilderness. She was a fierce protector of animals and was known for her independence and strength. Artemis was often depicted as a wild, untamed force, and her domain was one of freedom in the natural world. She represented the beauty and danger of nature, and her connection to the moon gave her an otherworldly presence. Artemis was a protector of women and children, but she was also a goddess of vengeance when her domain was threatened. As the Olympians took their places and ruled over their domains, the world began to take shape in ways that were both grand and small. Each god had their own realm, their own followers, and their own unique power. The stories of the gods were intertwined with the lives of mortals, and the world was forever changed by the presence of these mighty beings. The rule of the Olympians marked a new chapter in the history of the world, a time when the gods walked among mortals, shaping destinies, creating myths, and leaving their mark on everything they touched. The world had changed forever after the Olympians had claimed their realms. The Titans had been defeated, and the gods of Olympus were now the rulers of the earth, the skies, the seas, and the underworld. Their power was absolute, and each god took their domain with great authority. It seemed like the dawn of a new era, a time of prosperity and peace, a time that would later come to be known as the Golden Age. But the question remained, would the Olympians truly rule in peace, or would the weight of their power ultimately lead to conflict and strife? In the beginning, it seemed as though the gods had found harmony. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades ruled their realms with wisdom and might, and their siblings flourished in their own domains. The world was abundant, the crops grew, the seas were calm, and the heavens shone brightly. It was a time of peace for both gods and mortals, a time when the gods walked among humanity, offering blessings, guidance, and at times, challenges. People revered the gods, and the gods in turn cherished their creations. This was a time when mortals would hold festivals in honor of their divine rulers, offering sacrifices and prayers for the gods' favor. For Zeus, this time was especially important. He had finally claimed his place as the king of the gods, and now he sought to secure his reign, making sure that no one would challenge his authority. He was both the protector and the enforcer of cosmic order, ensuring that the laws of the universe were respected. But even Zeus, mighty as he was, could not escape the complexities of his relationships with the other gods. For all his wisdom and strength, Zeus was not immune to temptation, and it was his own actions that would spark conflicts that would echo through the ages. Zeus was married to Hera, his sister, and while their marriage was one of great importance, it was also fraught with tension. Hera, as the queen of the gods, was protective of her position, and her jealousy was as legendary as her beauty. She loved Zeus, but also resented his many infidelities, which were frequent and varied. Zeus, ever the powerful and charismatic ruler, could not resist the charms of mortal women and goddesses alike. His numerous affairs, which he often hid from Hera, became one of the most well-known aspects of their relationship. Hera, in turn, would often seek revenge against the lovers of Zeus, and sometimes even against the children that resulted from his affairs. This constant tension between them would shape much of the divine politics on Olympus and lead to some of the most dramatic and tragic stories in Greek mythology. One of Zeus's most famous affairs was with the Titaness Leto, who bore him 2 children, Apollo and Artemis. The story of their birth was one filled with both drama and triumph. Hera, in her jealousy, forbade Leto from giving birth on any land that saw the light of day. Leto wandered the earth in search of a safe place to give birth, but every land rejected her. Finally, Leto found the island of Delos, which was not yet solid land but floated on the sea. There Leto gave birth to Apollo and Artemis, twins who would become 2 of the most powerful and revered gods in Greek mythology. Apollo, the god of the sun, prophecy and music, would grow to become one of the most important gods of Olympus, while Artemis, the goddess of the moon and the hunt, would become a fierce and independent figure, beloved for her strength and protective nature. But it was not just the affairs of Zeus that defined the Golden Age. The world was filled with gods and goddesses who shaped the lives of mortals in a multitude of ways. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, was one of the key figures of this age. She was born from the head of Zeus after he swallowed her mother, Metis, and her wisdom became a guiding light for both gods and mortals. Athena's strategic genius and her connection to warfare made her a crucial figure in many of the most important myths and stories. But she was not just a warrior, she was also a protector of civilization, guiding the Greeks in matters of justice, law and governance. The goddess Demeter too played a significant role in this age, overseeing the harvests and ensuring that the earth remained fertile. Her love for her daughter Persephone and the bond between them was one of the defining stories of the Golden Age. Demeter's grief when Persephone was kidnapped by Hades was so intense that it caused the earth to go barren, and only when Persephone was returned to her mother did the crops begin to grow again. This myth not only explained the changing of the seasons, but also underscored the profound relationship between gods and mortals. The seasons, like the lives of mortals, were governed by the gods, and the earth's fertility was a direct result of their favor. Ares, the god of war, was another figure who shaped the events of the Golden Age, although his role was much more controversial. While Athena represented the more strategic and wise aspects of war, Ares reveled in the brutal and chaotic side of battle. His presence in the world was often associated with destruction and bloodshed, and he was a figure who inspired fear rather than admiration. Despite his harsh nature, Ares was an essential part of the divine order. Without the chaos of war there could be no peace, and Ares's role in the world was one that reminded both gods and mortals of the delicate balance that existed between creation and destruction. During this time, the gods also interacted with the mortal world in more direct ways. Heroes like Heracles, Perseus, and Theseus were born from the union between gods and mortals, and their tales became some of the most celebrated stories of Greek mythology. These heroes, with their divine heritage and extraordinary feats, became symbols of the power and influence the gods had over the human world. But these heroes were not mere pawns in the gods' games. They were individuals with their own agency, driven by their own desires, and often caught between the demands of their divine parents and the needs of the mortal world. The mortal world, too, flourished during the Golden Age, and the gods were often depicted as being deeply involved in human affairs. The Olympians did not stay hidden on Mount Olympus. They came down to earth to shape the lives of mortals in both subtle and direct ways. Temples were built in their honor, and festivals were held to celebrate their greatness. Mortals offered sacrifices and prayed to the gods, hoping for good harvests, safety in battle, and favor in their personal lives. The gods in turn responded to these prayers, either granting their wishes or punishing them for their transgressions. The relationship between gods and mortals was one of constant interaction, with the gods acting as both protectors and judges. Despite the apparent peace and prosperity of the Golden Age, the gods were not immune to the forces of change. Their power, their relationships, and their domains would continue to evolve, and the harmony that existed during this period would eventually be tested. The gods' very nature was one of constant transformation, and with each passing age, new stories, new heroes, and new challenges would arise to shape the course of the world. The Golden Age, though a time of relative peace, was not meant to last forever. It was a time of beginnings, of establishing dominance and order, but it would eventually give way to new struggles and new challenges. For the gods, nothing was permanent, and their reign would be constantly tested by the unpredictable forces of fate. The Golden Age, as beautiful and prosperous as it was, did not last forever. The gods, for all their power and grandeur, were not immune to the forces of change and conflict. The harmony of Olympus, though magnificent, would soon be tested by the unpredictable nature of both the divine and mortal worlds. As the gods' influence over the earth grew stronger, so did the ambitions, desires, and rebellions of humankind. It was only a matter of time before the gods found themselves at odds with the very mortals they had once revered and nurtured. The first sign of trouble began with the rise of the Titans' children, creatures who had once been the gods' enemies but who now sought to challenge the Olympians' rule in their own way. The greatest of these was the giant Typhon, a monstrous creature so terrifying that even the gods of Olympus trembled at the thought of his wrath. Typhon was born from Gaia, the earth itself, and he was said to be the most fearsome creature ever to walk the earth. With serpentine coils for legs, hundreds of dragon heads spitting fire, and eyes that glowed with fury, Typhon was a being of chaos and destruction, a force that sought nothing less than the total annihilation of the Olympian gods. The challenge Typhon posed was not only physical but existential. He represented the primal chaos that lay beyond the orderly reign of the gods. His very existence threatened to tear apart the very fabric of the world that the Olympians had worked so hard to create. Zeus, the mighty ruler of the gods, was the first to face Typhon in battle. The gods had been aware of the giant's growing strength for some time, and Zeus knew that he had to protect Olympus and the mortal world from this monstrous threat. The battle between Zeus and Typhon was unlike any other in the history of the gods. Thunderbolts cracked through the sky and lightning danced across the heavens as Zeus hurled his most powerful bolts at the fearsome creature. But Typhon was no ordinary foe. He could absorb the thunderbolts and throw them back at Zeus with terrifying force. The two titans of power clashed in a storm of fire and fury, their struggle shaking the foundations of the earth. The battle raged for days, with neither side gaining the upper hand. But Zeus, with his unwavering strength and determination, finally managed to subdue Typhon. With one final bolt of lightning, Zeus struck Typhon down, sending the giant crashing to the depths of the earth. There, in the farthest reaches of the underworld, Typhon would be imprisoned, his threat to Olympus and the mortal world temporarily quelled. Yet even in defeat, Typhon's presence left a lasting mark on the world, a reminder of the chaos that lay just beyond the boundaries of the gods' power. It was a warning that no matter how strong the Olympians were, there would always be forces that sought to challenge them, to test their authority, and to remind them that their reign was not absolute. In the wake of Typhon's defeat, the gods returned to Olympus, but their peace was short-lived. The mortals too began to stir. The stories of the gods, their power and their influence over the natural world had spread far and wide. The people, who had once lived in awe of the Olympians, began to question their rule. Some mortals felt that the gods were too distant, too detached from the struggles of everyday life, while others began to believe that the gods were simply too powerful and needed to be challenged. The concept of fate and the will of the gods, which had once been accepted without question, now came under scrutiny. It was in this environment that the first great mortal rebellions against the gods began. The first of these rebellions came from a man named Prometheus, a titan, who had sided with the Olympians during their battle against the older generation of titans. Prometheus, however, did not share the same reverence for the gods that many of his fellow immortals did. He saw the plight of mortals, who lived without the gifts of the gods, and he grew increasingly frustrated by the Olympians' indifference toward them. In particular, Prometheus was angered by Zeus's decision to withhold fire from humanity. To the mortals, fire was the key to civilization, warmth, and progress. Without fire, they were doomed to live in darkness and primitive conditions. In defiance of Zeus's command, Prometheus took it upon himself to steal fire from Mount Olympus and bring it to the mortal world. With great cunning, he smuggled the fire away from the gods and delivered it to humanity. The mortals, in turn, received the gift of fire, with gratitude and wonder. For them it was nothing short of a divine blessing. However, Zeus was enraged by Prometheus's defiance. He could not allow a titan to defy his authority, especially one who had once been an ally. Zeus ordered Prometheus to be bound to a rock, where an eagle would come every day to feast on his liver, which would regenerate every night, subjecting him to eternal torment. The punishment was a brutal one, a reminder that no one, not even the mightiest of titans, could escape the wrath of the gods. Prometheus's rebellion, however, was only the beginning. The mortal world, inspired by his courage, began to question the authority of the gods in other ways. Heroes like Heracles, Perseus, and Theseus, who were born of divine parentage, started to push back against the gods' control over their destinies. While the gods had given these heroes great strength and abilities, they also placed burdens on them that often seemed unfair. These heroes were not content to simply follow the whims of the gods. They sought to carve their own paths, to prove their worth and to challenge the divine forces that controlled their fates. One of the most famous of these heroes was Heracles, a demigod born from the union of Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmene. Heracles was known for his incredible strength and courage, and his 12 labors, which he was tasked with completing by the god Eurystheus, are some of the most famous stories in Greek mythology. The labors were impossible feats, slaying the Nemean lion, capturing the golden hind of Artemis, and cleaning the Augean stables, to name just a few. Each labor tested Heracles' strength, wit, and determination, and he faced many challenges from both mortal enemies and the gods themselves. Yet, through it all, Heracles never faltered. His victories were not just victories over monsters or foes, they were victories over the very gods who had set him on this impossible path. In many ways, Heracles' story was a rebellion against the will of the gods, a demonstration of mortal strength, resilience, and defiance. As Heracles' labors continued, the gods watched with a mixture of awe and frustration. The heroes of the mortal world were no longer passive recipients of divine will, they were active participants in the shaping of their own destinies. This shift in the balance of power marked the beginning of a new age, one in which the gods no longer ruled unchecked. Mortals, once considered mere pawns in the gods' games, now stood as equals in many ways, capable of challenging divine authority and forging their own paths. And so the gods and mortals continued to clash, sometimes in battle, sometimes in subtle ways, but always in a struggle for control. The age of the Olympians was not one of perfect peace, but one of constant change, where the lines between divine and mortal, fate and free will, were blurred in ways that would shape the world for centuries to come. The great struggles of this age would lay the foundation for the myths and legends that would echo through the ages, stories of defiance, rebellion, and the eternal tension between gods and men. As the gods and mortals continued their complex dance, the mortal realm saw the rise of heroes whose deeds would become legendary. These heroes were born from both divine and mortal bloodlines, and their stories were a testament to the power of determination, bravery, and sometimes the inability to avoid fate. The Olympians, with all their power and grandeur, were still heavily involved in the lives of these heroes, either guiding them or throwing obstacles in their way to shape their destinies. These stories would become the heart of Greek mythology, stories that would inspire generations and serve as reminders of both the gods' favor and their wrath. One of the greatest heroes in this era was the mighty Heracles, born of Zeus's union with the mortal Alcmene. From the moment of his birth, it was clear that Heracles was destined for greatness, but his life would also be marked by endless trials and suffering. Heracles' birth was, in itself, a cause for turmoil in the heavens. Zeus had planned for him to be the greatest of all heroes, but Hera, his jealous wife, was determined to ensure that this would not be the case. Hera's hatred for Heracles was intense and unrelenting, and she sought to make his life as difficult as possible from the moment he was born. When Heracles was just an infant, Hera sent 2 giant serpents to kill him in his cradle, but the baby was so strong that he strangled them both with his bare hands. This feat of strength marked the beginning of his legendary exploits, but Hera's jealousy didn't end there. She continued to torment Heracles throughout his life, sending him on a series of impossible labors that would test his strength, resolve, and ability to overcome the most fearsome creatures and tasks. The 12 labors, which were commanded by King Eurystheus, were so difficult that many believed no mortal could survive them. But Heracles, with his immense strength and fierce determination, succeeded in completing each one, overcoming every challenge placed before him. Each of the 12 labors was a story of its own, and each brought Heracles closer to becoming the ultimate symbol of heroic virtue. The first labor to slay the Nemean lion was perhaps the most famous. The Nemean lion was a creature so fierce and powerful that no weapon could pierce its hide. But Heracles, using only his strength, strangled the beast with his bare hands. From then on, he wore the lion's skin as a cloak, a symbol of his victory over one of the most terrifying creatures in the land. The second labor, to capture the golden hind of Artemis, tested Heracles' patience as much as his strength. The hind was swift and elusive, and it took Heracles a year to capture it without killing it, honoring the goddess Artemis in the process. Each labor was more difficult than the last, and the more Heracles accomplished, the more his name spread across the land as a hero who was almost beyond mortal. Yet, despite his great deeds, Heracles' life was far from simple. His path was riddled with pain, loss, and sorrow. He was constantly pursued by the shadow of tragedy, and the gods' interventions often complicated his life. Even after completing the 12 labors, Heracles' story was far from over. He would face more challenges, including the loss of his wife, Megara, and the madness that Hera sent upon him, causing him to kill his own children. It was a tragic episode in his life that would haunt him for years. Heracles' punishment for this act was to perform more labors in a quest for redemption, but even then the gods' jealousy, anger, and manipulation continued to shape his fate. Throughout it all, however, Heracles was driven by one thing, the desire to atone for his sins, no matter the cost. This drive for redemption, even in the face of unimaginable suffering, made him one of the most compelling and enduring heroes of Greek mythology. But Heracles was not the only great hero of his time. Perseus, the son of Zeus and the mortal Danae, also rose to legendary status through his own incredible feats. Perseus's story begins with a prophecy that he would one day kill his grandfather, King Acrisius of Argos, which set in motion a series of events that would lead him on an adventure filled with danger and divine intervention. Perseus was sent on a quest to slay Medusa, the Gorgon, whose gaze could turn anyone to stone. With the help of the gods, Perseus was equipped with magical gifts, a reflective shield from Athena, a sword from Hermes, and winged sandals to allow him to fly. Using his wits and the gifts from the gods, Perseus was able to find Medusa's lair and behead the monster, thus saving the world from her deadly gaze. The story of Perseus did not end with the slaying of Medusa though. On his way back from his quest, he encountered the beautiful Andromeda, who was chained to a rock as a sacrifice to a sea monster. Perseus, ever the hero, rescued her, and they fell in love. The two were married, but Perseus's actions had consequences. When he returned to Argos, he unwittingly fulfilled the prophecy and killed his grandfather Acrisius, though it was by accident. This act, though unintended, weighed heavily on Perseus, as he had no desire to harm his family. Yet, despite the tragedy of the prophecy, Perseus's journey was ultimately one of triumph, and he and Andromeda went on to rule as king and queen, ensuring that his legacy would endure. Yet another hero who rose to fame during this era was Theseus, the legendary king of Athens. Born to the mortal Aethra and the god Poseidon, Theseus was destined to become a hero, and his adventures began early. Perhaps his most famous deed was the slaying of the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull creature that lived in the labyrinth beneath the palace of King Minos on Crete. The Minotaur had been terrorizing the people of Athens, demanding a tribute of young men and women every year. Theseus, determined to end the creature's reign of terror, volunteered to be part of the tribute and set sail for Crete. Upon arrival, he was aided by Minos's daughter Ariadne, who gave him a ball of thread to help him navigate the labyrinth. Theseus successfully found the Minotaur and killed it, freeing Athens from its deadly grip. Theseus's bravery did not stop with the Minotaur. He went on to accomplish many other feats, including helping to unite the scattered city-states of ancient Greece into a more unified Athens. His reign was marked by wisdom and strength, and his adventures continued to serve as inspiration for generations of Athenians. However, like many heroes, Theseus's life was marred by tragedy and loss. His wife Phaedra fell in love with his son Hippolytus, and when he rejected her, Phaedra falsely accused him of assault, leading to Hippolytus's death. The grief of this event was too much for Theseus, and his later years were marked by sadness and isolation. These heroes, Heracles, Perseus, and Theseus, were only a few of the many who rose to greatness during the era of the Olympians. Their stories, though unique, shared common themes: the struggle against impossible odds, the interference of the gods, and the inevitable consequences of fate. While their heroic deeds earned them fame and honor, they were also reminders of the price of greatness. Heroes were not immune to tragedy or loss. Their lives were defined by the very struggles they overcame. The gods, while often seen as guides or protectors, also played a role in shaping these heroes' destinies, sometimes helping them and sometimes hindering them, depending on their own whims. In the end, the lives of these heroes were shaped by forces beyond their control, and their stories serve as enduring testaments to the power of the gods and the resilience of mortals. As the gods continued their reign over both Olympus and the mortal realm, a shift began to occur. The golden age of the great heroes was slowly coming to an end, and the inevitable downfall of many would follow. The once glorious figures of Heracles, Perseus, and Theseus, whose names had been sung by poets and chroniclers for generations, now began to face darker fates. Their stories were not merely tales of triumph. They were also sagas of loss, tragedy, and the overwhelming weight of destiny. While the gods' interventions had guided them toward greatness, these same gods were also the architects of their heroes' falls. Their once favored mortals pushed into situations from which there was no escape. Heracles, having completed the 12 labors and seeking peace after a lifetime of trials, was not free from the whims of the gods. His fate, forever tangled with the forces of Olympus, would take yet another dark turn. It began when Heracles married Deianira, a woman he loved deeply, though his life was already full of the shadows of his past deeds. One day, when Heracles and Deianira were traveling together, they crossed paths with the centaur Nessus, who offered to help them across a river. As Nessus carried Deianira on his back, he attempted to abduct her. In a furious rage, Heracles shot the centaur with one of his poisoned arrows, killing him. As Nessus lay dying, he tricked Deianira into believing that his blood was a love potion that would ensure Heracles' eternal fidelity. She kept a vial of this blood, thinking it would protect their love from any threat, but in truth, it was poisoned. Years later, when Heracles was away, Deianira became worried that another woman, Iolaia, was threatening their marriage. In a moment of misguided desperation, Deianira applied the potion of Nessus to a robe and sent it to Heracles. When Heracles donned the robe, the poison began to burn his skin, causing excruciating pain. Realizing what had happened, Heracles was devastated. The pain became unbearable, and Heracles, knowing his end was near, built his own funeral pyre. With the help of his friend Philoctetes, he set himself on fire, seeking an end to his torment. In the end, Heracles was taken up to Olympus, where the gods, pitying him for the suffering he had endured, granted him immortality. But even in his ascension, Heracles' story was a reminder of the cost of greatness. The tragic hero who, despite overcoming impossible odds, could not escape the consequences of his own actions and the manipulation of the gods. Perseus, too, met a tragic end, though his story was one of redemption and fulfillment. After slaying Medusa and rescuing Andromeda, Perseus returned to his homeland of Argos, only to find that fate had a final bitter twist in store for him. He had unintentionally fulfilled the prophecy that foretold he would kill his grandfather, King Acrisius. Perseus, trying to avoid the prophecy, had traveled far away to a distant land to escape Argos. But by chance he participated in an athletic competition, where he threw a discus that accidentally struck Acrisius, killing him. The prophecy had come true despite Perseus's every effort to prevent it. This tragic event led Perseus to feel guilt and sorrow for the rest of his days, even as he continued to rule as king. Although he eventually found peace with Andromeda and raised a family, the shadow of the prophecy would always hang over him, reminding him that even the mightiest heroes cannot escape the hands of fate. And then there was Theseus, another hero who had risen to great heights but fell into a tragic downfall. Theseus, like Perseus, had been instrumental in uniting Athens and securing its place among the most powerful city-states of Greece. His greatest deed, the slaying of the Minotaur, had been a feat of strength and cunning, but even his success came with a price. Theseus' life after the Minotaur was marked by triumphs, including numerous military victories and political reforms that made Athens a more powerful and prosperous city. But as with many heroes, the gods were never far from his side, often testing his resolve and placing obstacles in his path. One of Theseus's greatest tragedies was his betrayal of his own son Hippolytus. Theseus's wife, Phaedra, fell deeply in love with Hippolytus, who was devoted to the goddess Artemis and had no interest in his stepmother. In her desperation, Phaedra falsely accused Hippolytus of assaulting her, a claim that led to his death. Theseus, believing his wife, cursed his son, sending him into exile, and Hippolytus was struck by a terrible fate. His chariot was overturned by a monstrous bull sent by the gods, and he was killed. Theseus was left devastated, not only by the loss of his son but by the realization that he had been tricked by the gods, who had played a cruel hand in his life. The tragedy of Theseus' family was a reflection of his own life, a hero who had saved others, only to be undone by his own tragic flaws and the divine forces that shaped his fate. But it was not only the heroes who suffered under the hand of fate. The gods themselves were not immune to the consequences of their own actions. Zeus, the king of the gods, had many lovers, both mortal and immortal, and his numerous affairs often led to pain and suffering. One of the most famous of his affairs was with the mortal woman Leda, who was seduced by Zeus in the form of a swan. From this union, two of the greatest figures in Greek mythology were born, Helen of Troy and her brother the twin god Castor, who would both play pivotal roles in the great Trojan War. But the story of Helen in particular was one marked by tragedy. Her beauty was so great that it caused the downfall of an entire civilization, as the Trojan War was fought over her love. Helen, though she had been married to Menelaus, king of Sparta, was abducted by Paris, prince of Troy, and this act sparked a war that lasted 10 years, with both mortals and gods taking sides. Zeus, though the most powerful of the gods, was not immune to the consequences of his own actions. His relationships with mortals and the children that resulted from them were often sources of tension and strife. Some of these children, like Perseus and Heracles, became great heroes, but others, like Helen, were caught in the web of fate, their lives forever marked by the gods' manipulations. Zeus, despite his power, was as much a part of this divine tragedy as the mortals he watched over. A god who could shape the world but could not always control the consequences of his own decisions. The stories of these heroes, Heracles, Perseus, Theseus, are ultimately stories of both triumph and tragedy, and they reflect the complex relationship between the gods and mortals. While the gods bestowed greatness upon their chosen heroes, they also shaped their destinies in ways that were often cruel and unforgiving. Heroes, despite their strength, wisdom, and courage, were always at the mercy of the gods and fate. Theseus, Perseus, and Heracles may have been immortalized in myth, but their lives were reminders that even the mightiest of beings must face their own mortality, suffering, and the consequences of their actions. As the great heroes of Greece began to fade into legend, the world of mortals was once again swept up in the chaos of war. This time, the story took a different shape, one filled with gods, prophecies, and mortal decisions that would echo through history. The Trojan War, one of the most famous conflicts in Greek mythology, was not just a war between men, but a struggle between gods and mortals, each with their own motives, desires, and grudges. It all began with a seemingly simple event, a wedding. But this wedding, the marriage of Peleus and Thetis, would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the destruction of an entire city and the loss of many lives, both mortal and divine. Thetis, a sea goddess, and Peleus, a mortal king, were to be married in a grand celebration, and the gods themselves were invited to the event. But there was one notable exception, Eris, the goddess of discord. She had not been invited to the wedding, and feeling slighted, she decided to cause trouble. Eris appeared at the wedding uninvited, rolling a golden apple into the midst of the festivities. The apple, inscribed with the words "for the fairest," was meant to spark a dispute among the goddesses. Immediately, three of the most powerful and beautiful goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, claimed the apple for themselves, each believing they were the rightful recipient. Unable to settle the matter themselves, the goddesses turned to Zeus, the king of the gods, to make the decision. Zeus, ever wise but often caught between competing desires, was in a difficult position. He knew that choosing one goddess would enrage the others, and so he decided to pass the responsibility to a mortal. The mortal chosen was Paris, the young prince of Troy, who was known for his beauty and fair judgment. The goddesses appeared before Paris, each offering him a bribe to sway his decision. Hera promised him power and rule over all of Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and military success, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love, promised him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, seduced by Aphrodite's offer, chose her as the winner, awarding her the golden apple. This decision, though seemingly simple, would have devastating consequences for both Troy and Greece. As promised, Aphrodite helped Paris win the love of Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, who happened to be married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. Paris, guided by Aphrodite's favor, seduced Helen and took her back to Troy. This act of abduction set the stage for the Trojan War. Menelaus, enraged by the loss of his wife and the dishonor brought upon him, called upon the other Greek kings and heroes to help him retrieve Helen. An oath had been sworn by all the suitors of Helen, and now it was time to fulfill that oath and come to the aid of Menelaus. The Greeks, led by the powerful king Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother, assembled a massive army and set sail for Troy, determined to bring Helen back and punish the Trojans for their crime. The gods, as always, were not neutral in this conflict. Their involvement in the Trojan War was crucial, as each deity chose sides based on their own personal interests, alliances, and grudges. Hera, who had been slighted by Paris's decision, sided with the Greeks, determined to see the Trojans fall. Athena, too, supported the Greeks, though her reasons were more rooted in her love for wisdom and strategy. Aphrodite, however, remained loyal to Paris and the Trojans, as she was the one who had orchestrated his victory. The god Apollo also favored the Trojans, while the warrior goddess Artemis, his twin sister, supported her brother's cause. Poseidon, though neutral at the start, would later play a key role in the war. And of course, Zeus, the king of the gods, watched over the war from afar, though he remained somewhat distant, trying to maintain a balance between the warring sides. The war itself was brutal, lasting for 10 long years, and during this time both sides experienced victories and losses. The Greeks, despite their superior numbers and strength, were initially unable to breach the walls of Troy, which were said to be nearly impregnable. The Trojans, under the leadership of King Priam and his son Hector, fought fiercely to defend their city. Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors, became a symbol of bravery and honor. His duels with the Greek heroes, particularly with Achilles, were legendary. Achilles, the mightiest of the Greek heroes, was nearly invincible, save for his heel, which had been left vulnerable when his mother dipped him in the river Styx as an infant. Throughout the war, Achilles was a force of nature, his rage and thirst for vengeance often blinding him to the broader consequences of the war. One of the most significant moments of the war came when Agamemnon, leader of the Greeks, angered Achilles by taking his war prize, Briseis. Achilles, enraged and insulted, withdrew from the battle, refusing to fight for the Greeks any longer. This was a devastating blow to the Greek forces, as Achilles was their greatest warrior. Without him, the Greeks struggled, and the Trojans began to gain the upper hand. In Achilles' absence, Hector led the Trojan forces to victory after victory, and it seemed as though the Trojans might actually win the war. But the Greek forces, desperate to turn the tide, sent emissaries to Achilles begging him to return to the battle. Achilles, though still angry, was moved by the pleas of his fellow warriors and in particular by the words of his friend Patroclus. Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, donned Achilles' armor and led the Greek forces into battle, hoping to inspire the troops and turn the tide. But Patroclus was slain by Hector, and his death became the catalyst for Achilles' return to the battlefield. Consumed by grief and rage, Achilles rejoined the fight, determined to avenge the death of his friend. His battle with Hector was one of the most fateful moments of the war. Achilles killed Hector in single combat, then desecrated his body by dragging it behind his chariot. This act, though satisfying in the short term, would later haunt Achilles, for it was an affront to the honor of the Trojans and their gods. Despite Achilles' vengeance, the war was far from over. The gods continued to intervene, their actions shaping the fate of the warriors and the city of Troy. Eventually, the Greeks, aided by the gods and through cunning and strategy, would manage to bring Troy to its knees. The fall of Troy would come through the use of the famous Trojan horse, a trick devised by Odysseus, one of the greatest Greek heroes. The Greeks hid inside a massive wooden horse, which was left as a supposed offering to the gods. The Trojans, believing they had won and that the Greeks had finally left, brought the horse into their city. In the dead of night, the Greek soldiers emerged from the horse and opened the gates of Troy, allowing the Greek army to pour into the city and destroy it. The fall of Troy was a tragic and brutal event, and its consequences were felt not only by the Trojans but by the Greeks as well. Though they had won, the Greek victors were not without their own losses and challenges. Many of the Greek heroes, like Odysseus, would face difficult and long journeys home, filled with trials and tribulations. The gods, ever fickle, continued to shape their fates, and the aftermath of the Trojan War would be marked by both victory and sorrow. The Trojan War was more than just a conflict between mortals. It was a reflection of the complicated relationship between the gods and the men they watched over. The gods, though they could influence the outcome, were also caught in the web of fate and rivalry, often causing as much destruction as they prevented. The heroes of the war, though celebrated for their bravery, were ultimately mortal, and their stories were colored by the inevitability of death and loss. The Trojan War marked the end of an era of great heroes and the beginning of a new age, one where the gods would no longer intervene as directly in the lives of mortals. The war, with its great battles, its divine interventions, its tragic consequences, would echo through the ages as a reminder of the power of fate, the cost of war, and the ever-changing relationship between gods and men. The end of the Trojan War marked both the triumph and the downfall of many Greek heroes. While the Greeks had won the war, they had lost much in the process, both in terms of life and the consequences of divine wrath. The journey home for the victors would not be easy, and none would experience the full weight of this more than Odysseus, king of Ithaca. The great hero, known for his cunning and resourcefulness during the war, would find that his true challenge lay not on the battlefield, but on the treacherous journey home, a journey that would last for 10 long years and test his very soul. When the Greeks finally left the shores of Troy, victorious but weary, no one anticipated the trials that lay ahead. The gods, having been involved in the Trojan War from the beginning, would continue to meddle in the lives of mortals, especially Odysseus, who had incurred the wrath of Poseidon, god of the sea. Though Odysseus had played a crucial role in the Greeks' victory, his idea of the Trojan horse had led to Troy's fall. He was not without enemies. Poseidon, whose son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, had been blinded by Odysseus, was furious at the hero. With his wrath unleashed, Poseidon made sure that Odysseus' journey home would be filled with peril, storms, and impossible challenges. Odysseus' voyage began as he set sail from Troy with his men, eager to return to Ithaca and reunite with his wife, Penelope, and son Telemachus. But almost immediately, his fleet encountered trouble. On one of the first islands they visited, the island of the Ciconians, they sacked the city, only to be attacked in retaliation. The Greeks were driven off, and many of Odysseus's men were lost in the battle. This was just the beginning of the hardships Odysseus would face on his way home. The next challenge came in the form of the Lotus Eaters, a peaceful people who lived on a serene island. When some of Odysseus's men ate the lotus fruit, they fell into a deep stupor, forgetting their mission and desiring only to stay on the island forever. Odysseus, knowing he had to move on, forcibly dragged his men back to the ship and set sail once again. This was just another reminder that Odysseus's journey would be one not only of physical trials, but of the constant temptation to forget his true purpose, to return home to Ithaca. Next, they encountered the Cyclopes, a race of monstrous giants who lived on a remote island. The Cyclops Polyphemus, in particular, was infamous for his terrifying strength and brutal nature. Odysseus and his men, upon landing on the island, made the fateful decision to visit Polyphemus's cave, hoping to receive hospitality, as was customary in Greek culture. Instead, they were trapped by the one-eyed giant, who began devouring them one by one. In a stroke of genius, Odysseus devised a plan to escape. He convinced Polyphemus to drink wine until he passed out, then told the Cyclops his name was Nobody. Once the Cyclops fell asleep, Odysseus and his men drove a sharp stake into Polyphemus's single eye, blinding him. When Polyphemus cried out for help, he told his fellow Cyclopes that Nobody was attacking him, so they left him alone. The next morning, as Odysseus and his men tried to escape, Polyphemus, now blind, reached out and grabbed them, but Odysseus used his cunning once again. He hid his men under the sheep, and as Polyphemus let his sheep out to pasture, Odysseus and his crew sneaked away, escaping the island. But as they sailed away, Odysseus, in a moment of pride, called out to Polyphemus and revealed his true name. This act of hubris would cost him dearly. Polyphemus cursed Odysseus, calling upon his father Poseidon to punish the hero. From that moment, Poseidon's wrath would follow Odysseus throughout his journey. The sea god made sure that Odysseus would face many more trials before he could finally return home. The next leg of Odysseus's journey took him to the island of Aeolus, the god of the winds. Aeolus, moved by Odysseus's bravery and wisdom, gifted him a bag of winds to help him on his journey home. With the wind at his back, Odysseus was almost within sight of Ithaca, but his men, curious about the contents of the bag, opened it while Odysseus was asleep. The winds escaped, sending them far off course, and back to Aeolus's island. This time, Aeolus refused to help them, deeming them cursed by the gods. Odysseus and his crew were left to face even more challenges. Their next encounter was with the Laestrygonians, a race of giant, cannibalistic monsters. The Laestrygonians attacked the Greek ships, sinking all but Odysseus's vessel, and devouring many of his men. Once again, Odysseus was forced to rely on his wit and determination to survive. He managed to escape the island, though the losses continued to mount, and the weight of the journey grew heavier. Soon after, Odysseus and his men reached the island of Circe, a powerful sorceress, who transformed some of his crew into pigs. With the help of the god Hermes, who gave him a magic herb to protect him from Circe's spells, Odysseus confronted the sorceress. After a series of trials, Circe agreed to return Odysseus's men to their original forms and promised to help him on his journey. But before he could leave her island, Circe told Odysseus he would need to visit the underworld to seek guidance from the blind prophet Tiresias, who could reveal the secrets of his journey home. With a heavy heart, Odysseus sailed to the realm of the dead, where he encountered the souls of his fallen comrades and sought the wisdom of Tiresias. Tiresias warned Odysseus of the dangers that lay ahead, urging him to avoid harming the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios, and to remain humble if he ever hoped to return to Ithaca. Armed with this knowledge, Odysseus continued his journey, only to face yet more trials, including the deadly allure of the sirens, whose beautiful singing lured sailors to their doom. Odysseus, ever the clever strategist, had his men block their ears with wax, while he himself, curious to hear their song, ordered himself tied to the mast of the ship, unable to act on his desire to follow the sound. As the trials continued, Odysseus and his men finally reached the island of the sun god, where they made the fatal mistake of slaying and eating the sacred cattle. Despite warnings, their hunger and desperation led them to disregard the god's laws, and they paid the price. Theseus in fury sent a storm to destroy the rest of Odysseus's fleet, killing all of his men and leaving him stranded alone. Odysseus, though nearly broken, was not ready to surrender. He drifted for years, encountering more challenges, including the nymph Calypso, who detained him on her island and offered him immortality. Yet despite the temptations, Odysseus longed for his home, his wife and his son. Finally, after a long and arduous journey, he was released by the gods and returned to Ithaca. There he found his home overrun with suitors vying for Penelope's hand, believing him dead. In the climactic final scenes of the Odyssey, Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, revealed himself to the suitors, and with the help of his son Telemachus, defeated them in a bloody confrontation. Odysseus was reunited with Penelope, and peace was finally restored to Ithaca. The story of Odysseus is not only one of adventure and cunning, but also one of resilience and determination. His journey, filled with trials and temptations, mirrors the very human struggle to return to one's roots and to overcome the obstacles that stand between oneself and home. The gods, ever powerful, were always there, guiding, hindering, or punishing, but ultimately it was Odysseus's own will and cleverness that saw him through the darkest of times. The Odyssey remains one of the greatest tales ever told, a story of heroism, hardship, and the enduring power of home. After the fall of Troy, the gods' involvement in mortal affairs began to shift. The Trojan War had exhausted the Greek world, but it also marked a pivotal moment in their history. While some heroes returned home, others were thrust into new adventures, and the landscape of mythological Greece was changing. The gods, though not as directly involved as during the war, continued to influence the lives of mortals, their desires and rivalries still affecting the heroes who would follow. The Age of Heroes, though in its twilight after the Trojan War, was still alive in stories and songs. One of the most famous of these heroes was Heracles, or Hercules, as the Romans later called him. Heracles' story was a tale of unimaginable strength and relentless perseverance. The son of Zeus and the mortal Alcmene, Heracles' birth was marked by a prophecy that he would become the greatest of all heroes. This prophecy, though promising, came with a heavy price. Hera, Zeus's wife, was filled with jealousy and hatred for Heracles, knowing that her husband's infidelity had led to his birth. Hera's anger would haunt Heracles throughout his life, making his journey not only one of physical trials but emotional and psychological torment as well. From an early age it was clear that Heracles was different. He displayed immense strength even as a child and performed feats that seemed impossible. However, his strength was not just physical, it was the strength of will, an indomitable spirit that would see him through the toughest of trials. Yet despite his great abilities, Heracles was not immune to the influence of the gods. Hera in particular would play a significant role in his suffering. The first major challenge of Heracles' life came when he was driven mad by Hera's jealousy. In a fit of rage, he killed his wife Megara and their children. When he regained his senses, he was horrified by what he had done. Seeking redemption for his actions, Heracles consulted the oracle of Delphi, who told him to serve Eurystheus, the king of Tiryns, and complete 12 seemingly impossible labors. These labors were meant to atone for his sins, but they also became the defining moments of his life, tests of his strength, intelligence, and endurance. The first of these labors was to slay the Nemean lion, a beast with a hide so impenetrable that weapons could not pierce it. Heracles, using his immense strength and wit, strangled the lion with his bare hands and used its own claws to skin it, making its pelt his armor. This was only the beginning. His next labor involved the 9-headed Hydra, a serpent-like creature whose heads regenerated whenever they were cut off. With the help of his nephew Iolaus, Heracles managed to burn the stumps of the heads, preventing them from regrowing, and eventually defeated the Hydra. One of the most famous labors was the capture of the Ceryneian hind, a sacred deer of Artemis. The task was to capture the deer alive, but it was no easy feat. Heracles chased the hind for an entire year, eventually catching it and bringing it back to Eurystheus. But even Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, could not stay angry at Heracles for long. Recognizing that his strength and determination were qualities to be admired, the next labor was to capture the Erymanthean boar, a monstrous beast that terrorized the land. Heracles chased the boar into deep snow, where he trapped it and brought it back to Eurystheus. After that he had to clean the Augean stables, which had not been cleaned in years, and were filled with an impossible amount of manure. Heracles completed this task by diverting 2 rivers to wash the stables clean, showcasing his ingenuity as well as his strength. As the labors continued, Heracles was tasked with capturing the Cretan bull, stealing the mares of Diomedes, obtaining the girdle of Hippolyta, and retrieving the cattle of Geryon. Each labor seemed more impossible than the last, but Heracles overcame them all. His final labor, however, would be the most difficult of all: to capture Cerberus, the 3-headed dog guarding the gates of the underworld. To do this, Heracles had to descend into the realm of the dead, facing not only the horrors of the underworld but also the wrath of Hades. With his usual determination, Heracles managed to subdue Cerberus and bring him back to Eurystheus, completing the 12 labors and earning redemption for his past sins. Heracles' feats made him one of the most celebrated heroes of Greek mythology, but his life was not without its tragedies. After completing the 12 labors, he went on to have many more adventures, including battles with giants and encounters with powerful gods. His eventual death came at the hands of his own wife, Deianira, who, believing she had been betrayed, gave him a tunic soaked in the poison of the centaur Nessus. The poison burned Heracles' skin and caused him great pain. In his final moments, he built his own funeral pyre and was consumed by flames. But Heracles' story did not end with his death. He was granted immortality and ascended to Mount Olympus, where he was reunited with the gods, his labors now a part of his legacy. Though Heracles was perhaps the most famous of the Greek heroes, he was not the only one. Another hero who would leave a mark on Greek mythology was Jason, leader of the Argonauts. Jason's quest to obtain the Golden Fleece was as much about his leadership as it was about the mythical objects and treasures he sought. With the help of the greatest heroes of the time, including Heracles, Orpheus and Atalanta, Jason sailed on the ship Argo to the distant land of Colchis, where the Golden Fleece was kept. Jason's adventures were fraught with challenges, from facing harpies to battling clashing rock. But his greatest challenge came when he reached Colchis and had to perform a series of impossible tasks set by King Aeetes. With the help of Medea, the king's daughter, who fell in love with him, Jason succeeded in obtaining the Golden Fleece. But his victory was bittersweet. Jason's betrayal of Medea, after she had helped him, would lead to tragedy, as Medea's vengeance would destroy his happiness and leave him alone in his old age. The Age of Heroes was not only a time of adventure, but also of deep moral lessons. The heroes of this era were not perfect. They were flawed and driven by personal desires, and their stories were often filled with moments of hubris and failure. Yet despite their flaws, these heroes became symbols of courage, strength, and resilience. They taught the Greeks about the importance of cleverness, the danger of pride, and the value of perseverance. The gods, though they played roles in these heroes' lives, were also distant figures at times, leaving their mortal creations to navigate their own fates. In the end, the rise of heroes and the myths that surrounded them became the foundation of Greek culture. These stories, passed down through generations, shaped the values of the Greek people and provided them with a framework through which to understand the world. The heroes may have been larger than life, but their struggles, triumphs, and failures were all too human. And in that they became timeless, their stories still told and retold in every corner of the world. The gods of Mount Olympus were not the only divine beings in Greek mythology. While the Olympians ruled with their power and wisdom, there were other creatures, older and more primal, who once held dominion over the world. These beings, known as the Titans, were the predecessors of the gods. They were powerful ancient entities who governed the world before the Olympians ascended to power. But the rise of the Olympians was not without conflict, and the clash between the gods and the Titans would be one of the most significant events in Greek myth, the Titanomachy, the great war between the two divine factions. The Titans were the children of Uranus, the sky, and Gaia, the earth. They were beings of immense strength and elemental power, and they ruled the cosmos in a time when the world was young. The most prominent of the Titans was Cronus, the youngest of the Titan children, who overthrew his father Uranus and became the ruler of the universe. His reign, however, was not one of peace. Fearing that his children might one day overthrow him just as he had overthrown his father, Cronus took a dark and violent step. He devoured each of his children as soon as they were born. This act of terror left Cronus without heirs and set the stage for the eventual downfall of the Titans. But his wife, Rhea, could not bear to see her children destroyed. When she was pregnant with her youngest child, Zeus, Rhea devised a clever plan. Instead of handing over Zeus to Cronus, she secretly gave birth to him in a hidden cave on the island of Crete. To deceive Cronus, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and gave it to him, convincing him that it was the newborn Zeus. Cronus, unsuspecting, swallowed the stone whole, and Zeus was spared. Rhea, knowing that the time would come when her son would be able to challenge Cronus, kept him safe and nurtured him until he was strong enough to confront the tyrant. As Zeus grew older, he learned of the terrible fate that had befallen his siblings. He knew that he was destined to overthrow Cronus and free his brothers and sisters from their imprisonment. With the help of his mother, Rhea, Zeus tricked Cronus into regurgitating the children he had swallowed. One by one, Hestia, Hera, Demeter, Poseidon, and Hades emerged from Cronus's stomach, fully grown and ready to fight. United under Zeus's leadership, the gods began to rally for a war against the Titans, with each of the Olympians bringing their unique powers to the conflict. The battle between the gods and the Titans, known as the Titanomachy, raged for 10 long years. It was a fierce and violent struggle, with the forces of order and chaos clashing at every turn. The Titans, led by Cronus, fought with all their might, but the Olympians had a crucial advantage. Zeus, the god of thunder, was not only immensely powerful but also clever and strategic. During the war, Zeus sought the help of the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, two ancient races of creatures who had been imprisoned by Cronus. The Cyclopes, skilled in the forging of weapons, gave Zeus his iconic thunderbolt, a weapon of unparalleled power. The Hecatoncheires, with their 100 hands, aided the gods in battle, throwing massive boulders at the Titans and wreaking havoc upon their ranks. As the war continued, the tide began to turn in favor of the Olympians. Zeus's thunderbolts struck fear into the hearts of the Titans, and the combined might of the gods proved too much for the ancient beings to withstand. Finally, after 10 years of battle, the Olympians emerged victorious. The Titans were defeated, and Zeus cast them down into the depths of Tartarus, the darkest part of the underworld, where they would be imprisoned for eternity. With the Titans defeated, the Olympians were free to rule the world, and Zeus took his place as the king of the gods. However, the Titanomachy was not the end of the struggles between the gods and other divine beings. The victory of the Olympians did not come without consequence, and new challenges arose in the wake of the Titans' defeat. One of the most significant of these challenges was the Gednomachy, the battle between the Olympians and the giants, a race of powerful beings born from Gaia, the earth herself. The giants, like the Titans before them, were determined to overthrow the Olympian gods and claim the cosmos for themselves. The giants were formidable foes, larger and more terrifying than the Titans, and they had a deep hatred for the Olympians. Their war against the gods was long and brutal, but the Olympians were not easily defeated. Once again, Zeus played a central role in the battle, using his thunderbolts to strike down the giants. However, the battle was not without its own twists and turns. The gods faced new challenges as the giants were able to fight back, and they were assisted by powerful figures such as Heracles, who was instrumental in helping the Olympians win. The Gednomachy culminated in the death of the giants, and the Olympians once again emerged victorious. Despite their triumphs, the gods were not invincible. Even after the defeat of the Titans and the giants, the Olympians would continue to face struggles and conflicts, both among themselves and with other divine beings. The balance of power on Mount Olympus was never guaranteed, and the gods were constantly vying for dominance. Zeus, as king, was often forced to assert his authority, but even he was not free from the conflicts and rivalries that plagued the divine realm. The defeat of the Titans and the giants marked the beginning of a new era for the gods, one in which they could rule the cosmos without challenge. But this rule came with its own set of challenges, as the gods had to contend with their own desires, jealousies, and ambitions. The stories of the gods' battles with the Titans and the giants are among the most dramatic and powerful in Greek mythology, demonstrating the immense strength and power of the divine beings who shaped the world. But they also serve as a reminder that even the gods, despite their immortality and power, were not invulnerable to conflict, strife, and the consequences of their own actions. As time passed, the reign of the Olympian gods continued, but their rule was not without challenges. The gods, though powerful and immortal, were not exempt from the ever-changing tides of fate. The mythological world of Greece saw the rise and fall of kings, heroes and mortals alike, and as each new generation of humans grew and faced their own trials, the gods found themselves drawn into their stories, sometimes as helpers and sometimes as obstacles. Yet, no matter how powerful the gods were, the growing awareness of mortality would become a key theme in the mythological narratives that followed. The Olympians, once young and vibrant in their victories over the titans and giants, were no longer unchallenged. The once solid relationships between gods were being tested. The gods like Hera, Poseidon, and Ares, who had played prominent roles in earlier stories, now found themselves caught up in new dramas and conflicts, some stemming from their own actions and others from the changing world around them. With the rise of heroes and mortals, the gods began to see their own significance waning, and with it, their power began to fray at the edges. The most notable of these mortal challenges came in the form of human ambition. Mortals, once limited by their human nature, had begun to achieve incredible feats. Great heroes like Theseus, Perseus, and Atalanta had demonstrated immense strength, intelligence, and courage, often defying the gods' expectations and limitations. These heroes, born of both divine and mortal unions, had risen to the heights of legendary status. In some ways, they were reflections of the gods themselves, symbols of power, but also of the vulnerability that even the divine could not escape. The story of Theseus, for instance, was one of tremendous achievement, yet marked by fatal flaws that mirrored the god's own struggles. He was the son of Poseidon, god of the sea, and Aethra, a mortal woman. His exploits included the slaying of the Minotaur, the great beast that lived in the labyrinth of Crete. He was celebrated as a hero, a man who could challenge the gods and win. Yet his story ended in tragedy. Theseus's downfall came in part because of his own pride and desire for recognition, qualities that the gods themselves often exhibited. After leaving the Minotaur's island, Theseus forgot to change the sails of his ship, a signal meant to tell his father, Aegeus, that he was safe. Aegeus, seeing the black sails and assuming that his son had died, threw himself into the sea, ending his life. The gods, once so proud of their children, now saw the tragic consequences of their own influence on mortals. Perseus, another demigod born of Zeus and the mortal Danae, experienced his own rise to fame. He became famous for slaying the Gorgon Medusa, whose gaze could turn people to stone, and for rescuing Andromeda from a sea monster. His heroism was unmatched, but like all heroes, he too was flawed. Perseus's story echoed the god's own struggles with fate, as even his most heroic acts could not escape the consequences of divine interference. In his case, the goddess Athena guided him, but even her assistance was ultimately shaped by the complex web of fate that bound the gods and mortals together. Atalanta, a fierce warrior and skilled huntress, was another hero whose story was deeply entwined with the gods. Born to a royal family, she was abandoned by her father and raised by bears. She was a master of the hunt and refused to marry unless a suitor could defeat her in a race. Atalanta's story highlights a recurring theme in Greek mythology, the struggle for independence and identity in the face of divine and mortal expectations. When she was finally tricked into marrying Hippomenes, after he used the gifts of the goddess Aphrodite to win the race, Atalanta's fate was sealed. Despite her strength, she was ultimately led by the will of the gods and the whims of love and passion. Her story, like those of so many others, demonstrates how even the most independent and powerful heroes were ultimately shaped by the forces beyond their control. While mortal heroes like Theseus, Perseus, and Atalanta demonstrated great feats of strength and courage, their stories also illustrated the complexity of human nature, the strengths and flaws, the virtues and vices that both gods and mortals shared. The gods, despite their immortality and power, were not immune to the same challenges. Their relationships were filled with jealousy, pride, anger, and love, much like those of humans. Even Zeus, the king of the gods, was not above these emotions, and they often led to the downfall of both gods and mortals alike. One of the most striking examples of this is the story of Zeus's infidelity. Zeus, despite being married to Hera, was infamous for his many affairs with mortal women and goddesses alike. His actions often led to conflicts between gods, as Hera would seek vengeance against the mortals who caught her husband's eye. Zeus's relationships with mortal women such as Leda, Alcmene, and Semele produced some of the most famous heroes of Greek mythology, like Heracles, Perseus, and Dionysus. However, these affairs often led to pain and suffering, both for the mortals involved and for the gods who became tangled in the consequences. The gods' inability to control their passions despite their immense power was a tragic reminder of the vulnerability shared by both divine and mortal beings. As the gods continued to engage in these complex and sometimes destructive relationships, their once unchallenged dominance began to erode. The rise of new gods and heroes, combined with the increasing involvement of mortals in their own destinies, signaled a shift in the balance of power. The Olympians were no longer the untouchable figures they had once been, and their influence was increasingly challenged by the actions of the very mortals they had once protected. The gods also began to see that their own struggles were not confined to the mortal realm. The rise of philosophy and the pursuit of knowledge by figures like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle presented new ideas about the nature of existence, ethics, and the role of the divine. These ideas questioned the very nature of the gods' existence and their involvement in human affairs. While the gods were still revered, the intellectual shift in Greek society began to cast doubt on their absolute authority, and the gods were no longer seen as infallible beings. As the ancient Greek world transitioned into the Hellenistic period, the gods' role continued to evolve. The rise of new empires, the spread of Greek culture, and the influence of foreign gods from Egypt, Persia, and elsewhere introduced new ways of thinking about the divine. The gods of Mount Olympus, while still an important part of Greek identity, began to share their place in the pantheon with gods from other cultures. The decline of the Olympian gods marked the end of an era in Greek mythology, one where divine power and influence were no longer absolute. The gods of Mount Olympus, despite their flaws and struggles, had shaped the world in profound ways. Their stories of power, love, jealousy, and vengeance became the foundation of Greek mythology. But as the world of the Greeks evolved, so too did the role of the gods. The gods, once so central to human affairs, began to recede into the background as mortals continued to shape their own fates. And in this shift, the ancient Greek gods, with all their flaws and grandeur, became more than just symbols of power. They became reflections of humanity itself. The Greek gods were powerful, immortal beings who lived on Mount Olympus. Their story begins with the Titans, ancient gods who ruled the world before the Olympians came to power. Cronus, the leader of the Titans, feared that his children would overthrow him, so he swallowed them. However, his wife Rhea saved their youngest son, Zeus, by tricking Cronus into swallowing a stone instead. Zeus grew up and led a rebellion against Cronus, freeing his siblings from Cronus's stomach. This began the Titanomachy, a great war between the Olympian gods and the Titans. With the help of other powerful beings, the Olympians defeated the Titans and took control of the universe. After the Titans were defeated, the Olympian gods ruled over the world, each one with their own domain. Zeus as the king of the gods and god of the sky, Poseidon as the god of the sea, and Hades as the god of the underworld. Other gods included Hera, queen of the gods and goddess of marriage, Demeter, goddess of agriculture, and Athena, goddess of wisdom. Despite their power, the gods often faced conflicts with each other, and their lives were filled with love, jealousy, and revenge. Many mortal heroes were born from the union of gods and humans. Heroes like Perseus, Theseus, and Heracles performed great deeds, such as slaying monsters or rescuing people. However, even the greatest of heroes faced flaws and tragic endings, often caused by their own pride or the interference of the gods. The gods' relationships with mortals were complicated, as the gods sometimes helped and sometimes punished them for their actions. The Titanomachy was followed by the Gigantomachy, a battle against the giants, and other conflicts that showed the gods' ongoing struggle to maintain power. Despite their immortality, the gods' lives were filled with personal conflicts, and their actions had lasting consequences for both mortals and other gods. Over time, as philosophy and human thinking evolved, the gods' influence began to fade. New ideas about the world and the nature of existence challenged the traditional worship of the gods. Even though they continued to be important in Greek culture, the gods no longer had the same absolute power they once did. In the end, the Greek gods' stories reflect both their immense power and their very human qualities. They were powerful beings, but they were also flawed and vulnerable, much like the mortals they ruled. Their stories, filled with love, betrayal, and ambition, became the foundation of Greek mythology, influencing the way people saw the divine and the mortal world.